When my son Mason stood up at his college graduation party and announced to everyone within earshot that I never did anything for him growing up, I felt something inside me break that I didn't even know could shatter. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs as I stood there in my best dress, the one I had saved up 3 months to buy just for his special day. I had been so proud, so excited to celebrate the boy I had raised alone, the young man who was about to walk across that stage and receive his diploma. But in that moment, surrounded by his friends, their parents, and extended family members, I became invisible in the worst possible way. The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. I could feel every eye in the room shift to me, some filled with pity, others with curiosity, all of them waiting to see how I would respond to such a public humiliation. My hands trembled as I set down the champagne glass I had been holding, the one I had lifted moments earlier to toast my son's achievement, the achievement I had spent 18 years making possible. You see, Mason had always been the center of my universe. From the moment I found out I was pregnant at 19, unmarried, and barely making ends meet at my minimum wage job, I knew my life would never be the same. His father disappeared the moment he heard the news, leaving me with nothing but empty promises and a growing belly that would soon house the most important person in my world. But I didn't see it as a burden. I saw it as a purpose. I worked double shifts at the diner while Mason slept in a bassinet behind the counter, the owner taking pity on a young mother who had nowhere else to turn. When he got older, I enrolled in night school, studying by lamplight after putting him to bed, determined to build a better life for both of us. The exhaustion was bone deep, the kind that seeps into your soul and makes every step feel like you're walking through quicksand. But I never complained, not once. By the time Mason was 5, I had earned my associate's degree and landed a job at an insurance company. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and it came with benefits that meant my son could see a doctor when he got sick. I remember the pride I felt walking into that office building every morning, knowing that every hour I spent behind that desk was an investment in Mason's future. The other mothers at his school drove nice cars and lived in houses with white picket fences, but I held my head high because I was doing everything in my power to give my son the best life possible. The sacrifices came naturally, so naturally that I barely thought of them as sacrifices at all. When Mason wanted to play Little League baseball, I worked overtime to pay for the equipment and registration fees. When he decided he wanted to try piano lessons, I gave up my cable subscription and started shopping at thrift stores to make room in the budget for his musical education. Every birthday party he attended meant I had to choose between groceries and a decent gift. But somehow, I always found a way to make sure he never showed up empty-handed. As he grew older, the expenses grew larger. High school brought new challenges, new dreams, and new costs that seemed to multiply faster than I could count them. Mason wanted to take advanced placement classes, which meant tutoring fees I hadn't budgeted for. He joined the debate team, which required travel expenses for competitions in neighboring states. When his guidance counselor suggested he apply to prestigious colleges, I knew that meant application fees, standardized test prep courses, and eventually tuition costs that made my head spin. But I never said no, not once. Every request, every need, every want that Mason expressed became my mission to fulfill. I picked up a second job on weekends, cleaning offices in the early morning hours, before my regular workday began. The janitor's closet became my second home, filled with the scent of disinfectant and the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered overhead as I mopped floors and emptied trash cans. My hands grew rough, and my back ached constantly. But when Mason bounded down the stairs each morning, excited about some new opportunity or adventure, every ache in my body felt worth it. College acceptance letters started arriving during his senior year of high school, and with them came financial aid packages that still left massive gaps in funding. Mason had his heart set on a private university 3 states away, the kind of school that promised connections and opportunities that could change the trajectory of his entire life. The cost was staggering, more money than I had ever seen in one place. But when I looked at my son's face, lit up with hope and possibility, I knew I would find a way. I refinanced my small house, the one I had worked so hard to buy after years of renting cramped apartments. The mortgage payments doubled, eating up most of my income, but it freed up enough cash to cover Mason's first year of tuition. I took out parent loans for the remaining 3 years, signing documents that committed me to debt payments that would extend well into my retirement years. My financial advisor, a kind woman who had watched me struggle for years, gently suggested that maybe Mason could start at a community college and transfer later. But I couldn't bear the thought of crushing his dreams before they had a chance to take flight. The care packages I sent to his dorm room every month were legendary among his friends. Homemade cookies, his favorite snacks, gift cards to local restaurants, and always a handwritten note reminding him how proud I was and how much I loved him. When he called complaining about his meal plan or his cramped living situation, I found ways to send extra money, even if it meant I ate ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights in a row. During his sophomore year, Mason decided he wanted to study abroad for a semester. The program cost nearly as much as an entire year of regular tuition. But when he called me, his voice bubbling with excitement about the opportunity to experience another culture and expand his worldview, I couldn't bring myself to crush that enthusiasm. I took on a 3rd job, working nights at a local grocery store, stocking shelves after the store closed. The fluorescent lights gave me headaches, and I often didn't get home until 3 in the morning, only to wake up 4 hours later for my day job. But Mason's Instagram posts from London and Paris made every sleepless night feel worthwhile. His junior year brought an internship opportunity in New York City, unpaid but prestigious, the kind that could open doors to amazing career opportunities after graduation. The cost of living in Manhattan was astronomical, but Mason assured me this was his chance to network with industry leaders and build connections that would last a lifetime. I emptied my emergency savings account and took cash advances on credit cards to fund his summer in the city. The interest rates were crushing, but I told myself it was an investment in his future, in our future. By Mason's senior year, I was drowning in debt, but somehow still finding ways to make ends meet. When he mentioned wanting to throw a graduation party to celebrate with all his friends and their families, I didn't hesitate to start planning. I wanted him to have everything, to feel celebrated and loved and accomplished. I rented a community center, hired a caterer, and even splurged on a professional photographer to capture every moment of his special day. The morning of his graduation, I woke up before dawn to get my hair done at the salon. Another expense I probably couldn't afford, but couldn't bring myself to skip. I wanted to look perfect for my son's big day, wanted him to be proud to introduce me to his friends and professors. I spent extra time on my makeup, choosing my outfit carefully, practicing the speech I planned to give when we toasted his achievements later that evening. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Watching Mason walk across that stage in his cap and gown, hearing his name called over the loudspeaker, seeing him accept his diploma with that brilliant smile I had loved since he was a baby, I felt every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched thin was worth it. This was what I had been working toward for 18 years. This was the moment that justified every choice I had made, every comfort I had given up, every dream of my own I had set aside. But then came the party, and with it, the words that would change everything between us forever. As I stood there watching my son bask in the laughter and approval of his friends, something crystallized in my mind with brutal clarity. This wasn't just teenage rebellion or college kid arrogance. This was calculated cruelty from someone who knew exactly how much those words would devastate me. Mason wasn't drunk or caught up in the moment. His eyes were clear, his voice steady, and when he looked at me across that crowded room, I saw something I had never seen before: indifference. The drive home from that graduation party was the longest 43 minutes of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles went white, and I had to pull over twice because the tears made it impossible to see the road. Everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my son crumbled away like sand between my fingers. Had I been living in some elaborate fantasy for 18 years? Had every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar I couldn't afford to spend been nothing more than background noise in his life? When I finally made it home, I sat in my driveway for another 20 minutes, staring at the house I had mortgaged to the hilt to pay for his education. The same house where I had spent countless hours helping him with homework, where I had nursed him through every childhood illness, where I had celebrated every small victory and comforted him through every disappointment. The windows looked back at me like empty eyes, and I wondered if those memories meant as little to him as his words suggested. Inside, the silence felt oppressive. Mason's childhood bedroom still looked exactly the same as when he left for college, preserved like some kind of shrine to a boy who apparently never existed. His high school trophies lined the shelves, certificates of achievement covered the walls, and his favorite stuffed animal from when he was 7 still sat on his pillow. I had kept everything exactly as he left it, thinking he would want to come home to familiar comfort during breaks and holidays. Now, it just felt like a museum dedicated to my own delusions. I poured myself a glass of wine, the expensive bottle I had been saving for his graduation celebration, and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the remnants of the life I had built around him. Bills were scattered across the surface, most of them related to his education. Student loan statements, credit card bills from his care packages, and emergency funds. The refinancing papers for my mortgage. The numbers seemed to mock me now. Tangible proof of how thoroughly I had bankrupted my own future for someone who saw it all as worthless. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I thought about myself, not as Mason's mother, not as the woman who worked 3 jobs to make his dreams possible, but as an individual person with my own needs and desires. When was the last time I had bought myself something nice just because I wanted it? When had I last taken a vacation, or gone out to dinner with friends, or even watched a movie I chose instead of whatever Mason recommended during our weekly phone calls? The answer was disturbing. I couldn't remember a single instance in the past decade where I had prioritized my own happiness over his convenience. Every decision I made was filtered through the question of how it would affect Mason. Every dollar I spent was weighed against what he might need. I had become so consumed with being the perfect mother that I had forgotten how to be anything else. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, replaying every interaction Mason and I had shared over the past few months, searching for signs I had missed, the phone calls that seemed increasingly brief and perfunctory, the way he deflected questions about his classes or social life, how he always seemed to have somewhere else to be whenever I suggested visiting or spending time together. I had attributed it all to normal college independence, the natural process of a young man finding his own way in the world. I never imagined he was simply growing tired of pretending to care about the woman who had given up everything for him. The following weeks passed in a strange haze of routine and revelation. I went to work, paid my bills, maintained the basic functions of daily life, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. The automatic impulse to call Mason and share good news or ask about his day had disappeared. For the first time in 18 years, my first thought when I woke up wasn't about him. It should have felt liberating, but mostly it just felt empty. Friends and co-workers noticed the change. Linda from the office, who had listened to countless stories about Mason's achievements over the years, asked if everything was okay. I gave her the standard responses about him being busy with post-graduation job hunting. But she wasn't fooled. The pride that used to light up my face whenever his name came up had been replaced by something much more guarded. My sister called from Atlanta, full of congratulations about Mason's graduation and eager to hear about the party. I found myself giving her a carefully edited version of events, unable to bring myself to repeat his words out loud. Saying them again would make them real in a way I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I told her it was a lovely celebration and changed the subject as quickly as possible. 3 weeks after graduation, Mason's first student loan payment came due. The bill arrived addressed to me as the co-signer, with a payment amount that made my stomach clench. I stared at that piece of paper for a long time, remembering the day I had signed those documents in the financial aid office. The counselor had explained the terms carefully, making sure I understood the commitment I was making. At the time, it had seemed like such a small price to pay for my son's future. Now it felt like a chain around my neck that would drag me down for the next 20 years. I made the payment, just like I had made every other payment related to his education. But this time was different. This time, I kept a copy of the receipt. I'm not sure why. Maybe some instinct was already warning me that I would need documentation of everything I had given him. Maybe I was finally starting to see our relationship with clearer eyes. The pattern continued over the next month. Bills arrived. I paid them, and I kept meticulous records. The credit card statement from his study abroad program, the final payment for his graduation party expenses, the insurance premium for the car I had bought him for his 16th birthday, the one he was still driving but had never offered to take over payments for. Each receipt went into a growing file folder that felt like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I was building. Mason called occasionally during those weeks, but the conversations were stilted and brief. He was job hunting, he said. The market was tough. He might need to move back home temporarily while he got on his feet. I made appropriate supportive noises, but something in my voice must have changed because he started ending our calls more abruptly than usual. It was during one of these awkward conversations that he mentioned running low on funds. His tone was casual, almost offhand, as if he were mentioning the weather. The checking account I had set up for him during college was nearly empty, he said. His rent was due soon, and his roommate was getting impatient about their shared expenses. Could I possibly help out, just until he found steady employment, the old me would have transferred money immediately, probably more than he asked for, along with a care package and an encouraging note. The old me would have worked extra hours or borrowed against my credit cards without a second thought. But the old me had died in that community center 3 weeks earlier, and the woman who had taken her place was someone entirely different. I told Mason I would think about it and get back to him. The surprise in his voice was unmistakable. In 18 years, I had never told him I needed to think about helping him. Money had always appeared when he needed it, as reliable as sunrise, as automatic as breathing. The idea that his mother might hesitate, might consider saying no, was clearly foreign to him. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at that growing file folder of receipts and statements. 18 years of documentation. 18 years of proof that his claim about me never doing anything for him was not just wrong, but spectacularly, insultingly wrong. Every piece of paper in that folder represented a sacrifice he had never acknowledged, a gift he had never appreciated, a mother's love he had taken for granted and ultimately dismissed as worthless. That's when the idea began to form. 2 months passed in this strange new reality, where I was learning to exist as something other than Mason's mother. I had started small things for myself, tiny acts of rebellion against the woman I used to be. I bought myself flowers at the grocery store, not because it was a special occasion, but simply because they were beautiful and I wanted them. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something I had always wanted to try, but never had time for when every spare moment was devoted to Mason's needs. The pottery wheel felt foreign under my hands at first, the clay slipping and sliding as I tried to shape it into something recognizable. But there was something deeply satisfying about creating something purely for myself, something that served no purpose other than my own pleasure. The instructor, a patient woman named Sarah, who was probably around my age, complimented my natural instincts with the clay. When was the last time someone had praised me for something that had nothing to do with how well I supported my son? My coworkers began commenting on the change in my demeanor. Linda mentioned that I seemed more relaxed, less anxious about constantly checking my phone for messages from Mason. She was right. The perpetual knot of worry that had lived in my stomach for 18 years had begun to loosen. I wasn't jumping every time my phone buzzed, wasn't immediately dropping everything to respond to his texts or calls. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, my attention wasn't completely focused on another person's needs. I had started sleeping better too, without the constant mental calculation of Mason's expenses, his schedule, his problems. My mind had space for other thoughts. I found myself reading books again, something I hadn't done for pleasure since before he was born. Mystery novels, romance stories, biographies of women who had overcome incredible odds. Each page felt like a small act of reclaiming myself. The file folder of receipts and documentation had grown thicker. Every statement, every bill, every record of financial support I had provided over the years now lived in organized sections within that folder. I had started adding things I hadn't initially considered. Photos of birthday parties I had thrown for him, complete with receipts for decorations and cake, screenshots of text conversations where he had asked for emergency money for various college crises, even old report cards that showed his academic achievements that had been possible because of the stable home environment I had provided while working multiple jobs. It became an obsession of sorts, this documentation project. Not a bitter one, but something that felt necessary. like I was finally creating an accurate record of our relationship. For years, I had lived with the narrative that Mason was this independent, self-made young man who had succeeded through his own merit and determination. His graduation speech had made that narrative explicit, but the evidence in my folder told a completely different story. There were receipts for school supplies that I had bought every August, from kindergarten through his senior year of high school. Hundreds of dollars each year for backpacks, notebooks, calculators, art supplies for projects. I found the paperwork from when I had hired a math tutor for him in 9th grade. After he struggled with algebra, the tutor had cost $60 per session, twice a week for an entire semester. I remembered working extra weekend shifts at the grocery store to cover those expenses. Medical records revealed another layer of support he had conveniently forgotten. Every doctor's visit, every prescription, every emergency room trip when he broke his arm playing basketball in 10th grade. I had carried health insurance on him until he aged out at 26, paying premiums that often stretched my budget to the breaking point. The dental work alone had cost thousands over the years. Braces, wisdom teeth removal, regular cleanings and checkups that I had prioritized over my own dental care. But perhaps the most revealing documents were the ones related to his extracurricular activities. Piano lessons that had lasted 3 years until he decided he preferred guitar. Guitar lessons that continued through high school. Basketball league fees, equipment costs, tournament travel expenses. Drama club costumes that I had sewn by hand because the store-bought options were too expensive. Science fair project supplies, art class materials, yearbook photos, class ring, graduation announcements. Each receipt was a memory, a moment when I had chosen his happiness over my own financial security. The senior trip to Washington, D.C. that had cost $800 I didn't have. The prom tuxedo rental and corsage for his date. The college application fees for 12 different schools because he couldn't decide where he wanted to go. The security deposits for 3 different apartments during his college years when he changed living arrangements. I started calculating totals, something I had never done before because the numbers had always felt too overwhelming. The tuition and fees alone came to over $100,000 across 4 years. Room and board for the years he lived on campus added another $60,000. The study abroad program had cost $15,000 for just 1 semester. Personal expenses, care packages, emergency funds, travel money for him to come home during breaks, all of it carefully tracked and documented. When I reached the final tally, I had to sit down and pour myself a glass of wine. The total amount I had spent on Mason's upbringing and education was staggering. Nearly $300,000 over 18 years. Money I had earned through backbreaking work, sacrifice, and careful budgeting. Money I had borrowed against my future, mortgaging my retirement and my security for his benefit. $300,000. And he had stood in front of a room full of people and declared that I had never done anything for him. The irony wasn't lost on me, that this revelation came just as my financial situation was reaching a critical point. The student loans I had co-signed were now in repayment, with monthly obligations that consumed nearly 1/3 of my income. The credit cards I had used for his various emergencies and opportunities were maxed out, their minimum payments another significant monthly expense. My mortgage, refinanced to pay for his education, had payments that stretched well into my 70s. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly struggling financially, and it was entirely because of the choices I had made to support my son's dreams. The same son who apparently saw all of that support as nothing worth acknowledging. I started researching what my retirement would look like, given my current debt load. The projections were sobering. If I continued making minimum payments on everything while maintaining my current income level, I would be working well into my 70s. Social Security alone wouldn't cover my basic living expenses, let alone the loan payments that would continue for decades. The house I had mortgaged to pay for Mason's education might need to be sold just to manage the debt load. This wasn't self-pity, just cold mathematical reality. I had bankrupted my future for a son who saw my sacrifices as invisible, my love as worthless, my support as non-existent. The woman who had raised him alone, who had worked 3 jobs to make his dreams possible, who had given up every comfort and security for his benefit, apparently never did anything for him. During this period of financial reckoning and emotional processing, Mason's calls became more frequent. His job search wasn't going as well as he had hoped. The market was competitive, he explained, and entry-level positions were hard to find. His savings were running low, and his roommate was pressuring him about shared expenses. Could I help with rent this month? Just temporary assistance until he got on his feet professionally. I listened to these requests with a detachment that surprised me. The old me would have been frantic with worry, immediately transferring money, and probably adding extra for groceries and incidental expenses. The new me heard his words differently, not as a son in need, reaching out to his loving mother, but as someone who had taken my generosity for granted for so long that he couldn't imagine it might not always be available. His tone during these conversations revealed assumptions that had probably always been there, but I had been too devoted to notice. He never actually asked if I could afford to help. He never inquired about my financial situation or expressed concern for my well-being. The requests were presented as statements of need, with the unspoken expectation that I would immediately solve the problem. When I started responding with questions instead of immediate solutions, his frustration became apparent. Why did I need to know exactly how much money he had in his checking account? Why was I asking about his job search timeline? Why couldn't I just transfer the rent money like I always had? These questions had never been part of our dynamic before, and he clearly found them intrusive and unnecessary. But I persisted with the questions because I was genuinely curious about something. If I had never done anything for him growing up, as he had so publicly declared, then why was his automatic assumption that I should solve his current financial problems? If my role in his life had been so negligible, so forgettable, then why was I the first person he called when he needed money? The contradiction seemed lost on him entirely. In his mind, there was apparently no connection between dismissing my lifetime of support and expecting that support to continue indefinitely. I was simultaneously worthless as a mother and essential as a financial resource. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. 3 weeks into August, with summer heat pressing down on everything like a heavy blanket, Mason called in a state of genuine panic. His rent was 5 days overdue, he told me, his voice tight with anxiety. His landlord was threatening eviction if the payment wasn't received by the end of the week. His roommate had already paid his half and was furious about being potentially evicted because of Mason's portion. The job interviews he had been going on weren't converting to offers, and his checking account was completely empty. This wasn't the casual mention of needing help that had characterized his previous calls. This was desperation, raw and urgent. For the first time since graduation, he sounded like he genuinely understood that his situation was serious. The confident young man who had dismissed his mother's contributions in front of a room full of people was gone, replaced by someone who was scared and running out of options. I listened to his explanation calmly, making appropriate sympathetic sounds while mentally reviewing the contents of my documentation folder. 18 years of proof that his graduation speech had been not just wrong, but cruelly, spectacularly wrong. $300,000 of evidence that I had done everything humanly possible to support him, guide him, and prepare him for exactly this kind of independence. When he finished explaining his situation, there was a moment of silence while he waited for my response. In that silence, I could hear his expectation, his assumption that I would immediately spring into action to solve his problem just as I had solved every other problem throughout his entire life. The same woman he had publicly humiliated would once again sacrifice her own financial security to bail him out of a situation he had created. That's when I made a decision that would change everything between us forever. Instead of offering to transfer money, I told Mason I would call him back in an hour. I needed time to think, I explained. Time to review my own financial situation and consider what I could realistically do to help. His surprise was audible. In 18 years of requesting assistance, he had never been asked to wait for an answer. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table with that thick folder of documentation spread out in front of me. Receipts, statements, bills, records, photos, all the tangible proof of a mother's love that had been dismissed as nothing. The evidence of sacrifices he had never acknowledged, support he had never appreciated, and a lifetime of putting his needs before my own. I picked up my phone and began taking pictures of every single document in that folder, page by page, receipt by receipt, creating a digital record of 18 years of financial and emotional investment in a son who saw it all as worthless. When I finished, I had over 200 photos documenting nearly 3 decades of motherhood that apparently never happened. Then I started typing. The message I composed was methodical, deliberate, every word chosen, with the precision of someone who had finally found her voice after years of silence. I attached photo after photo to that text message, creating a digital avalanche of evidence that would be impossible for Mason to ignore or dismiss. Each image told a story he had conveniently forgotten. Each receipt represented a sacrifice he had never bothered to acknowledge. The first photos showed his elementary school years, field trip permission slips with my signature and the attached $20 bills for admission fees, school supply receipts from back-to-school shopping, year after year of notebooks and pencils and art supplies that I had carefully budgeted for even when my own shoes had holes in the soles. Birthday party invitations, where I had circled the gift suggestions and calculated how many extra shifts I would need to work at the diner to afford them. Middle school brought different challenges, different expenses, all meticulously documented. The basketball league fees when he decided he wanted to play sports, the cost of his uniform, his shoes, his equipment bag, tournament entry fees, and travel expenses for away games. The team dinner I had hosted at our tiny apartment, spending money I didn't have on pizza and soda, so the other kids would think Mason came from a family that could afford to be generous. High school photos showed the escalation of costs and complexity. SAT prep courses that cost more than I made in a week. College application fees to 12 different universities because he couldn't narrow down his choices. The senior trip to Washington, D.C., prom expenses, graduation party costs. Each image was time-stamped and dated, creating an undeniable timeline of continuous financial support. But the college years, Those photos told the most devastating story of all. Tuition receipts showing payments that exceeded my annual salary. Dorm room furniture I had bought and delivered during his freshman year, move-in weekend. Care package receipts from every month he was away, filled with his favorite snacks and toiletries, and gift cards for local restaurants. Emergency fund transfers when his laptop broke, when his car needed repairs, when he decided to join a fraternity and needed money for dues and social events. The study abroad program documentation was particularly revealing. Not just the $15,000 program fee, but the passport expenses, the travel insurance, the spending money I had provided, the credit card bills from his European adventures, screenshots of his social media posts from London and Paris, living his best life while I worked 3 jobs to fund his cultural expansion. I included photos of my work schedules during those years, showing the overnight shifts at the grocery store, the weekend office cleaning jobs, the double shifts at the diner, time cards stamped with arrival, and departure times that revealed a woman who barely slept, who worked around the clock to ensure her son never had to worry about money. Bank statements showing my account balances, dropping to single digits immediately after tuition payments. Proof of the financial tightrope I had walked for years. Medical records and insurance statements painted another picture of support he had forgotten. Every doctor's visit, every prescription, every emergency room trip when he played sports too aggressively or stayed out too late and needed medical attention. Dental bills for braces, wisdom, teeth removal, routine cleanings that I had prioritized over my own healthcare needs. Vision insurance that covered his contact lenses and designer frames while I wore the same glasses for 5 years. The Christmas and birthday photos were perhaps the most heartbreaking evidence. Pictures of him surrounded by gifts I had saved for months to afford. The bicycle when he was 8, the computer when he turned 16, the car for his 18th birthday. His face in those photos showed pure joy and excitement, the expression of a child who felt loved and celebrated. But apparently, those moments meant nothing to the man who stood up at his graduation party. I documented the co-signed loans, the refinanced mortgage, the credit card debt I had accumulated to support his dreams, financial statements showing my retirement savings being depleted, my emergency fund being emptied, my future security being sacrificed for his present opportunities. Every signature on every loan document, every payment confirmation, every interest charge that would follow me into my 70s. The apartment deposits, utility connections, renter's insurance policies I had paid for during his college years, the furniture I had bought for each new living situation when he changed roommates or decided he needed a different environment, kitchen supplies, bedding, electronics, everything needed to set up independent living arrangements while he focused on his studies instead of working part-time jobs like most of his peers. I included screenshots of our text message conversations over the years, the constant stream of requests for money, and my immediate responses with payment confirmations. Need money for textbooks, followed by my transfer receipt. Car registration due, with my payment confirmation. Rent increase this semester, and my adjustment of his monthly allowance. Years of financial conversations that revealed a pattern of asking and receiving that he had taken completely for granted. But I also included the other messages, the ones that showed the emotional support that apparently meant nothing to him. My encouragement during his difficult freshman year when he was homesick and struggling with independence, my pride when he made Dean's List, my celebration of his internship acceptance, my excitement about his study abroad opportunity. Hundreds of messages from a mother who believed she was supporting her son's journey to success, not funding someone who would eventually dismiss her existence. The final photos in my collection were the most recent ones, bills that were still arriving with my name as cosigner, loan statements showing repayment schedules that would extend into my retirement years, credit card balances that represented emergencies and opportunities I had funded for someone who saw my contributions as invisible, the mathematical reality of what his education and support had cost me, and what it would continue to cost for decades to come. When I finished compiling the digital evidence, I had created something that was part historical record, part financial audit, and part emotional reckoning. 237 photos that told the story of 18 years of single motherhood, of sacrifices made and gifts given and love expressed through actions rather than words. It was the biography of a woman who had given everything to raise a son who would grow up to publicly humiliate her. The message I typed to accompany these photos was brief, direct, and completely void of the maternal warmth that had characterized every previous communication between us. No pet names, no expressions of love, no automatic reassurance that everything would be okay. Just facts, presented with the clinical detachment of a business transaction. "Mason," I wrote, "you mentioned at your graduation party that I never did anything for you growing up. I've attached documentation of everything I actually did. The total financial investment in your upbringing and education comes to $297,432. This doesn't include the opportunity costs of my time, the career advancement I sacrificed to be available for your needs, or the personal dreams I set aside to focus on yours." I paused before typing the next paragraph, knowing that these words would fundamentally alter our relationship forever. But something inside me had crystallized during those weeks of documentation and reflection. I was tired of being taken for granted. I was exhausted from being treated as an automatic solution to problems rather than a person deserving of respect and appreciation. "Before I can consider helping with your current financial situation," I continued, "I need you to pay me back for the investments I made in your future. I'm not asking for the full amount immediately, but I do need to see a payment plan and a timeline for reimbursement. You're a college graduate now, presumably capable of managing adult financial responsibilities. It's time to start acting like it." The final paragraph was the hardest to write, but also the most necessary. "I worked 3 jobs for years to make your dreams possible. I sacrificed my retirement security, my health, and my personal happiness to ensure you never had to worry about money. I did all of this because I loved you and believed in your potential. Your graduation speech made it clear that none of that mattered to you until you can acknowledge the reality of what I actually did for you and begin making concrete steps to repay the financial investment I made. I won't be providing any additional support." I attached all 237 photos to the message and hit send before I could second guess myself. The delivery confirmation appeared immediately, followed by the red receipt that showed Mason had opened the message within minutes of receiving it. Then came the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a son processing information, but the heavy silence of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. I imagined him scrolling through photo after photo, seeing documented proof of 18 years of support he had dismissed as non-existent, the receipts that revealed the true cost of his opportunities, the sacrifice behind every gift, the love expressed through actions he had never bothered to notice. My phone remained quiet for the rest of that evening. No immediate response. No angry callbacks. No desperate texts trying to explain away his graduation speech. Just silence from a young man who had probably never considered that his actions had consequences, that his words had power to wound, that his mother was a human being with feelings rather than just a financial resource. I spent that evening in my garden, tending to the tomato plants I had started growing after Mason left for college. There was something deeply satisfying about nurturing something that would eventually feed me, about investing time and energy in something that would provide direct benefit to my own life. The soil felt cool and rich between my fingers, and the late summer light cast everything in golden warmth that made the world feel hopeful, despite the emotional earthquake I had just initiated. For the first time in 18 years, I had chosen my own emotional well-being over Mason's comfort. I had refused to enable his irresponsibility and had demanded acknowledgement of my contributions to his life. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like jumping off a cliff while simultaneously growing wings. The next morning brought a series of text messages that revealed Mason's thought process as he worked through the implications of my photo documentation. The first message arrived at 6:30 in the morning, suggesting he had spent most of the night reviewing the evidence I had provided. "Mom, I had no idea you kept track of all this stuff," he wrote, as if my documentation was somehow the problem, rather than his dismissal of my contributions. "I never asked you to spend that much money on me. You made those choices yourself." The deflection was breathtaking in its audacity. According to this logic, every Christmas gift had been my decision rather than his desire. Every tuition payment had been my choice rather than his education. Every emergency fund transfer had been my initiative rather than his request for help. He had somehow managed to transform 18 years of responsive parenting into a series of unilateral decisions that he bore no responsibility for appreciating. His second message arrived an hour later, after he had presumably thought more about the implications of my repayment request. "I can't pay you back that kind of money, Mom. I just graduated. I don't have a job yet. This is crazy. Parents are supposed to help their kids without keeping score." There it was, the entitlement laid bare. Parents were supposed to give without expecting acknowledgement, support without requiring appreciation, sacrifice without receiving respect. According to Mason's worldview, I owed him financial support simply by virtue of being his mother, while he owed me nothing in return, not even basic courtesy or recognition of my efforts. The third message revealed his growing panic as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "My landlord is going to evict me if I don't pay rent by Friday. You can't just cut me off like this. I'm your son. You're supposed to help me when I'm in trouble." The irony was stunning. The same person who had publicly declared that I never did anything for him was now demanding that I continue doing things for him. The son who had dismissed my lifetime of support was now claiming that support as his birthright. He wanted all the benefits of having a devoted mother without any of the responsibilities of being a grateful son. I read his messages calmly while drinking my morning coffee, feeling oddly detached from the desperation in his words. The old me would have been frantically texting back, reassuring him that we could work something out, probably transferring money immediately to relieve his anxiety. The new me recognized his panic as the natural consequence of taking someone's generosity for granted for too long. My response was measured and firm. "Mason, you're 22 years old with a college degree. You're not a child who needs his mother to solve every problem." The documentation I sent shows exactly what I did for you growing up, which contradicts your public statement that I never did anything. Until you can acknowledge that reality and take steps to repay the investment I made in your future, I won't be providing additional financial support. I added, there are resources available to help people in your situation. Contact local social services, look into emergency rental assistance programs. Consider taking any job available rather than waiting for the perfect position. These are adult solutions to adult problems. His response came within minutes, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I heard something in his written voice that I had never heard before. Fear. Real, genuine fear that his safety net might not be there anymore. That the woman who had always solved his problems might actually mean what she was saying. Mom, please. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. I've never had to handle stuff like this on my own. Can't we talk about this repayment thing later? After I get a job and get back on my feet? The vulnerability in his message tugged at something deep in my maternal instincts. The same instincts that had driven 18 years of sacrifice and support. Part of me wanted to immediately rescue him from his fear, to transfer the rent money and worry about acknowledgement later. But I forced myself to remember his graduation speech. The casual cruelty of dismissing my entire contribution to his life in front of people who knew how hard I had worked to support him. This fear he was feeling now, this anxiety about his future security, this uncertainty about how he would manage adult responsibilities, this was exactly what I had been protecting him from his entire life, by always being there with immediate solutions and financial rescue. I had prevented him from developing the resilience and problem-solving skills he needed as an independent adult. More importantly, I had protected him from understanding the true value of what I provided. He had never experienced the anxiety of wondering where rent money would come from, because I had always made sure it appeared. He had never felt the stress of choosing between different expenses, because I had always covered everything he needed. He had lived his entire life in a bubble of financial security that I had created through backbreaking work and sacrifice, and he had mistaken that bubble for the natural order of the universe. Now, for the first time, he was experiencing what I had felt every month for 18 years. The stomach-churning worry about making ends meet. The desperate calculation of available resources versus necessary expenses. The fear that comes with real financial vulnerability. It was a harsh education, but perhaps a necessary one. My response to his plea was gentle, but unwavering. Mason, the fear you're feeling right now is what I lived with every day for 18 years. The difference is that I couldn't call my mother to solve my problems because I was a single parent working multiple jobs to support both of us. You have options available that I never had. Use them. I continued. If you can find a way to acknowledge what I actually did for you growing up and commit to a realistic repayment plan for the money I invested in your future, we can discuss how to move forward. But I won't continue enabling someone who sees my sacrifices as worthless and my support as invisible. The read receipt showed that he had seen my message, but no response came. Hours passed in silence that felt different from his usual communication patterns. This wasn't the casual delay of someone busy with other activities. This was the heavy quiet of someone whose assumptions about the world had been fundamentally challenged. I used that quiet time productively, researching rental assistance programs in his city and job placement services that specialized in recent college graduates. Despite my firm stance on not providing financial rescue, I wasn't heartless. If he was genuinely ready to take responsibility for his situation and acknowledge the reality of our relationship. I wanted to be prepared to offer practical guidance rather than just money. But I also spent time researching my own financial recovery options. Credit counseling services that could help me manage the debt load I had accumulated supporting his education. Retirement planning resources for people who had depleted their savings. Career coaching for older workers who might need to extend their earning years to compensate for financial setbacks. The documentation project had shown me the true cost of my generosity, but it had also revealed the extent of the financial hole I had dug for myself. Even if Mason never repaid a single dollar, I needed to start making concrete plans for my own financial future. The woman who had spent 18 years prioritizing her son's needs over her own security now faced the reality of working well into her 70s, unless she made significant changes. That evening, as I reviewed my monthly budget and tried to identify areas where I could reduce expenses, my phone finally rang. Mason's name appeared on the screen, and I could see from the call duration that he had let it ring longer than usual, probably hoping I would answer out of maternal concern rather than letting it go to voicemail. When I did answer, his voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less confident than the young man who had dismissed his mother's contributions at his graduation party. The bravado was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like humility. "Mom," he said, and even that single word carried more weight than usual. "I've been thinking about everything you sent me, all those photos and receipts and stuff. I guess I never really thought about how much everything cost." I waited for him to continue, refusing to fill the silence with reassurance or make this conversation easier for him. This was his moment to demonstrate whether he had truly processed what I had shown him, or whether he was simply trying a different approach to get what he needed. "I still think parents should help their kids," he continued, "but I can see that maybe I took some things for granted. I didn't know you worked 3 jobs to pay for college. I thought financial aid covered most of it. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Acknowledging ignorance wasn't the same as taking responsibility. Admitting he took things for granted wasn't the same as expressing genuine appreciation. And suggesting that parents should help their kids completely ignored the fact that he had publicly claimed his parent had never helped him at all. "Mason," I said carefully, "what specifically are you acknowledging? Because your graduation speech wasn't about taking things for granted. You told a room full of people that I never did anything for you growing up. That's not an oversight or ignorance. That's a fundamental misrepresentation of 18 years of our relationship." The silence that followed was longer than I expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was showing off," he admitted. "Some of the other guys were talking about how they were self-made, how they had worked for everything they got. I wanted to sound like that too, independent, successful on my own merit. There it was, the truth that made everything worse rather than better. He hadn't forgotten my contributions or been ignorant of my sacrifices. He had deliberately erased me from his story because acknowledging my support would have diminished his narrative of self-made success. I had been inconvenient to his image, so he had simply written me out of his history. "So you threw me under the bus to impress your friends," I said, and I could hear the brittleness in my own voice. "You sacrificed your mother's dignity for your own ego. I didn't think you would take it so seriously," he said, which somehow made it even worse. "I thought you knew I didn't really mean it, but I had taken it seriously, because it was said seriously in a public forum to people who knew both of us." His casual dismissal of my reaction suggested he had never considered that his words might actually hurt me, that his mother might be a real person with real feelings, rather than just a resource to be managed. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mason gradually revealing more about his mindset during the graduation party and his assumptions about our relationship. What emerged was a portrait of someone who had lived his entire life in a bubble of privilege so complete that he couldn't even see it. My sacrifices hadn't been invisible to him. They had been expected. My support hadn't been unnoticed. It had been assumed as his natural due. He had never questioned where the money came from because he had never needed to. He had never wondered about the cost of his opportunities because someone else had always handled the bills. He had never developed gratitude for what he received because he had never experienced want or uncertainty. In some ways, this revelation was more painful than thinking he had simply forgotten or overlooked my contributions. Deliberate dismissal was worse than accidental ignorance. Calculated cruelty cut deeper than thoughtless words. He had known exactly what he was doing when he stood up at that party, and he had chosen his image over my feelings. When we finally hung up, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely clear about what needed to happen next. Mason had acknowledged his behavior and explained his motivations, but he hadn't apologized. He had admitted to taking things for granted, but he hadn't committed to changing that pattern. Most importantly, he hadn't addressed the fundamental issue of repaying the investment I had made in his future. The rent crisis that had prompted his desperate outreach was still unresolved. His landlord was still threatening eviction. His financial situation was still precarious. And despite our lengthy conversation about his graduation speech and his recognition of my past support, he still seemed to expect that I would ultimately provide the solution to his immediate problem. Sometimes the most powerful lesson we can teach someone is what life feels like without the very thing they claimed never existed. Mason learned that summer what real independence actually costs, what genuine self-reliance demands, and what it means to face consequences without a safety net he had taken for granted his entire life. He found a job eventually, moved to a smaller apartment, and began the long journey of understanding that respect isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn. As for me, I discovered that saying no to someone who has taken you for granted isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them fall far enough to finally understand how much they need to grow.